Welcome back to another Lazy Shell tutorial video. Today we're going to talk about the Animations editor. Before we begin, it's worth noting that this is one of the more complicated editors that Lazy Shell has to offer. You don't have to know how to code to use this program, but I'd say this is the editor where being a programmer will come in the handiest. I'm not a coder, but I have managed to figure out enough of this to get by. I'll warn you right now, I don't know what every command in this editor does. In fact, even the creators of Lazy Shell don't know what everything does. If you ever see a line command that has the raw, unlabeled hexadecimal code, like this, that means the creators couldn't figure out what it does, so they didn't name it. We'll talk about the different commands and what they do, but that's only the beginning. The real meat of animations is how the commands all come together to form a full animation. I'll also walk through my thought process a bit so you can see how you can figure out what some of these things do. Something you might notice right off the bat is there is no option to add or delete commands. You can only modify and move existing commands, so what we can do with this editor is somewhat limited compared to what you can do in the Events editor. The creator of Lazy Shell has called the Animations editor temperamental, if that gives you any indication of what you're in for. In general, I will say you should aim for changing as little as you can in this editor while still accomplishing your goal. If you take the time to master this editor, you can do a lot with it, but speaking from experience, prepare for a lot of trial and error. In this video, I'm going to go over the different types of animations you can edit in this editor. I'll have a follow-up video to go in depth into the different commands that you can use. Let's look at this menu of things we can change. Just to remind you, I'm using Yakobom's updated version of Lazy Shell, version 3.19. This version has more scripts to edit than the old version does, so if you're using that old version, you won't see all of these options here. Monster behaviors. This controls the various things that monsters do in battle that aren't their attacks, spells, or their entrances. Things like when a monster dies, how it behaves when it runs away, the sound effects it uses, how the monster reacts when it's hit by something, the coin showers that appear when some bosses die, and even some more specific things, like the shysters that appear in the smithy fight, or the buttons that bow your hits with an arrow to disable your commands. You'll notice that these scripts aren't labeled, they just say script number whatever. Even though they aren't labeled, you can sometimes figure out what it does if you read the commands in the script. For example, this first command here says, if target is disabled, jump to address. These 6 digits to the left of a command are its location in the game's code. Even though we can't see this address in this particular script, we can take an educated guess as to what it does by reading the rest of the code. You can see that the very next line says, visibility on. So reading through the code, it says, if the target is not disabled, we continue on to this next line, which is making the target visible. My guess then would be that if this target is disabled, we would jump to an address with a visibility off command. Let's look for that address and see if we can find it. Something important to note about these commands jumping to different addresses is that every address within one of these drop-down menus will have the same first 2 digits. In other words, every address under monster behaviors will start with 35. So if you're looking for this address, this tells you that the only digits you need to focus on are the last 4. So let's see if we can find this address 0790. Event number 6. We found it. Sure enough, here's that visibility off command we were expecting. With monster behaviors, I wouldn't recommend changing much of anything in here. If you want a monster to behave a different way, say you want it to not move at all when it's hit, as opposed to sliding backward a bit, you can change those properties in the monster's editor, which we'll talk about in a different video. There are various properties in the monsters editor that you can change that reference these events here, so trying to change what a monster does through editing these scripts can easily change what multiple monsters do by accident. So it's best not to edit these unless you know for sure what it's doing. Try to do what you need to do through the monsters editor and come here as a last resort. Monster spells. Monster spells are one of the easier animations to understand. Most of them are relatively short and follow a lot of the same patterns. For example, you'll often see a few commands to display the name of the spell and another command to dim the screen. Drain, for example, is a pretty easy one to follow. There's the section to display the spell's name, play the sound effect, summon the fireball itself, move it toward the target, and then summon the explosion and sound effect from hitting the target. Something to note is that these 4 dummy spells are actual spells. These are Smithy's chest head spells that apply different status effects to you, the ones that have the psychedelic colors. But those spells don't display a spell name when they're used, so the creators of the game never gave them names. Monster attacks. These control the various physical, non-spell attacks that monsters can do. Most monster attacks are used by multiple monsters, so you'll often see a series of commands like this that say, if amem 8-bit equals some number, jump to this, or jump to that, etc., for these different sound effects. The reason being, in the monsters editor, you can choose what sound effect you want a monster to use. So what this does is, it checks what type of sound that monster is supposed to be using and plays that sound. Most normal physical attacks that monsters use are not labeled. They don't have names because the name doesn't display in battle. There is a bit of guesswork that you have to do in order to find the attack that you're looking for. Thankfully, the monster attack number here corresponds to the monster attack number that's used in the monsters editor when you're choosing an attack for the monster to do. You can also see attacks that are named in here. For example, the chomp attack, where monsters like Croco will throw random objects at you. Monster entrances. These are how the monsters appear on the field when they come to the battlefield. They're all named, which is handy. These correspond to the entrance style properties that monsters have in the monsters editor. Just like with monster behaviors, multiple monsters reference these events, so if you change one, you change the entrance for any monster that uses it. Items. These are animation scripts for every item in the game. One thing you might notice is that any item that isn't used in battle, like Flower Tab, doesn't have an animation script. It's empty. That may seem obvious, but what this means is that there are no extra animations to work with. This means that if you want to create a custom item with a custom animation, you're going to have to replace an item that already exists. For those of you who are curious about freebies, let's go to the mushroom script and look down at the very bottom of it. Every item that can give a freebie has this script down below. The key thing to look at are these 2 lines. Pick a random number between 0 and 100. In this case, for a mushroom, if that random number is 26 or higher, the script jumps down here, skipping giving you a freebie. For those of you doing the math, that's a 25% chance of getting a freebie whenever you use a mushroom. Ally spells. Personally, of all animation scripts, I think ally spells are the most complicated. There are some identifiable patterns, like when the game displays the card suit thing for certain spells, or when the game displays those red stars when Gino is powering up some of his spells, but there are a lot of things happening in these scripts. You can tell from the size of the scroll bar here that even something as simple as jump has a very long animation script. Going back to what I said before, I suggest editing as little as possible while still accomplishing your goal. Start out small, Edit those small things first to figure out what they do, then work your way up to bigger ones. Weapon animations. Something to note that the first 5 weapon slots, even though they have generic placeholder names for the empty equipment slots, hold the animation data for all allies' unarmed attack. For example, the weapon slot has Mario's unarmed attack. Armor has Toadstool's unarmed attack, and so on. Some animations are simpler than others. Mario's unarmed attack, for example, just calls his punching animation and a corresponding sound effect. If you time it, it loads the second half. Mario's hammer calls his hammer swinging animation and also calls the hammer itself as a separate sprite. Hurley Glove has all kinds of checks to make sure Mario is alive, not afflicted by any status effects, so that it will load his sprite rather than the Mario doll. For the most part, weapon animations fall under 2 categories: smacking with something or throwing something. The smacking animations are typically pretty simple. There's a command to call the ally's movement, and another to call the weapon's movement, if there is one. For those types of animations, you might consider editing the sprite sequences in the sprite editor to make something unique, rather than editing the animation scripts. I like to keep things simple. I've said it before, but keep animations as easy to follow as you can by editing as little as you have to, but that's up to you. Attacks where you throw something tends to be a bit more complicated. For example, Gino's handgun. It has bullets that hit the foe and empty shells that fall to the side after shooting, so there's a bit more you have to address. Weapon miss sounds. As I'm sure you know, the animations for most weapons are split into 2 parts. If you don't time an attack, or the attack misses, the second part of the animation doesn't play. For whatever reason, the sound effects for when that second half of the animation doesn't play isn't stored in that weapon animation script itself. It's stored separately within these scripts. To explain that a little bit better, let's go back to Mario's unarmed weapon animation script. You see 2 sound effects here, right? One for the first part of his attack, one for the second part of his attack. If you edit both of these sound effects, you only edit the sound effects of the timed version of the attack. If you don't time the attack, or it misses, it still plays this sound effect. Why is it structured that way? Only Nintendo and Square can answer that. Weapon timed hit sounds. If you thought the last scripts were weird, you're going to love these. Not only can you not edit untimed animation sound effects in the weapon animation scripts, there are some weapon animation scripts where you can't even edit all of the sound effects that play during the timed version of the attack. I know that sounds confusing, so let's look at an example. Back in weapon animations, animation number 3, labeled space, this is Gino's unarmed attack. Looking at the sound effects here, you only see one, right? This is the sound effect that plays when Gino's arm launches toward the enemy. Now let's go back to miss sounds. That same number, number 3. Here in miss sounds, this is the sound that plays when the attack misses or isn't timed. And now let's go to weapon timed hit sounds for that same one, number 3, and you'll see another sound effect here. This is the sound that plays when the attack is successfully timed. That's right, you have to edit 3 different groups of commands just to change one attack. Thankfully, not every attack has a sound effect in this editor. In fact, most don't. But now you know what to do if you can't find the weapon sound effect you're looking for. You may have noticed that each of these scripts has this group of commands down below it. I don't know why these are here. These seem to reference the screen flash effect that occurs with attacks that inflict instant death. Again, I don't know what this has to do with sound effects, but just to be safe, I wouldn't edit these. You can edit the sound effect command here at the top, but I wouldn't change anything else in here. Battle events. These are unique events that occur during battles. You can see what they're all labeled, which is handy. You've got the scripts for Mallow punching Croco, the chandelier falling when you beat Bowser, Bunt's various events like scaring off the chefs and being eaten by Booster, and so on. These are great for creating unique scenes in battle. They can also be pretty tricky to use. These scripts depend on things like which allies you took into the fight, which monster slot the enemies are in their battle formation, etc. There are a couple of commands used in battle events that you don't see used elsewhere. We'll talk about those later. Flower bonus messages. This is a pretty easy one. These control the messages that pop up when you get those bonus flowers from defeating enemies. You can see the layout here. We'll talk about the specific commands here in the next video, but I think you can get the gist of what these commands do just by looking at these scripts. Toad's tutorial. This is a confusing one for me. I'm not exactly sure what this is supposed to do, but looking through the script, I see that it summons a Terrapin and also Toad's sprite. There are different memory addresses being adjusted, but it's not clear to me what the intent is. What's more, if you look in the data for the tutorial battle, it references the battle event for Toad's tutorial, not this event. And if you want to see what Toad's tutorial battle event script looks like, here it is. There's an unknown command here, and not much else. So unfortunately, there's not much for me to tell you about this Toad's tutorial script. Last one, character weapon scripts. Don't you love how commands relating to ally weapons are stored in 4 different places? These control some of the more nitty-gritty details of using weapons. Things like where exactly the ally is positioned when they use the attack, commands to reset target memory so previous attacks don't interfere, making sure the ally moves back to their original position once the attack is done, etc. I can tell you that I made my 2 ROM hacks before these scripts ever existed in this editor, so you can easily get by without changing them. If an ally looks like they're in a weird spot when you use an attack that you've made, you may try editing these scripts, but really just because something exists to edit doesn't mean you have to edit it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And those are all the commands that you can edit in this editor. Like I said before, in a follow-up video, I'll talk about the specific commands over here in this Change Command window. If you find these videos to be helpful, and you want to see more of them, or if you just want to support the channel in general, please consider subscribing and liking. It does help. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.